Hello, everyone. My name is John McDonough. I'm a professor at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health in Boston, and I'm here today on behalf of the Petrie-Flom Center to introduce Dr. Karl Lauterbach. Dr. Lauterbach is an unusual professional. He's both a scientist and a politician. He is a member of the German parliament, the lower house, referred to as the Bundestag, since 2005. For about 20 years, he has been one of the most, if not the most, influential force in German health policy reform on many different levels, including the German system's approach to controlling the price of prescription drugs, which is our particular focus today. One of the reasons Dr. Lauterbach is here with the School of Public Health is because he is a graduate of our school. He got 2 master's degrees and a Doctor of Science degree back in 1995. He is on the faculty of the school, and we've asked to talk with him today about the German drug pricing regulatory system that is otherwise known as AMNOG, or AMNOG. But I'll start, Dr. Lauterbach, thank you for being here with us today, to ask you, can you briefly describe your health policy journey over the past 30 years or so?
Well, first of all, thank you so much, John, for making that possible. Hello to everyone. Thank you for the invitation. It's a great pleasure for me to be here. I come to Boston, roughly speaking, every 12 months because I'm an adjunct professor here at the Harvard Chan School, and my own journey into politics started when I came back to Germany after having spent roughly 10 years in the US. In 1995, I came back to Germany. I initiated Institute of Health Economics and Clinical Epidemiology at the University of Cologne. I became an advisor of the Social Democratic Party. In the late 90s, I was an advisor of that time Chancellor Gerhard Schröder for healthcare reforms. I did this for a couple of years, and in 2005, I decided to become a member of parliament myself, because at that time, I had been involved in so many laws for the Social Democrats as an advisor that I either had to step forward into politics or go back into university and become more independent again. And I opted for being a politician because I've always believed that health policy and management and epidemiology has to be carried into the political arena, that we should not be working for the library or for our colleagues alone, but we should also be working for the general public. And I was a strong believer that the German healthcare system needed better laws in terms of prevention politics. Evidence-based medicine was lacking to some degrees in these days, and also drug policy. So that was my own motivation. So I got involved in politics more and more and became a politician. I've never regretted this, despite the fact that it is a completely different lifestyle in comparison to the work in academia. So thank you for having me.
Having been a politician myself, I can appreciate the interplay. So we want to talk about the German drug pricing system, but clearly over your 20 years or so in the middle of German health policy, the prescription reforms were part of a larger family of reforms. And so maybe we could start by just asking you, can you characterize, describe the family of reforms that have happened in Germany over the past 20 years or so with your involvement?
But first of all, in the last 22 years, since '89, the Social Democrats, so the party...
99.
89.
1989, okay.
89. In the last 22 years, since '89, we have been, the Social Democrats, my party, we have been part of the government in 18 years, so roughly most of the time. Only 4 years we were in the opposition. So we had a long stretch of time of making, let's say, legal changes, changing the systems, for better or worse. And in that time, I was, let's say, early on, one of the primary advisors, and later I was very often the lead negotiator for the Social Democrats in Parliament. So I was very much involved, and it turned out to work well. So I had quite some influence, for better or worse, for the system. So I can give a history of what we basically did. In the early 2000s, it was quite clear that Germany had a couple of, let's say, structural problems. First of all, what we were doing in terms of our treatment was very often far away from evidence-based standards. We were not doing well in comparison to other industrialized countries when it came to, for example, diabetes care. So we were treating patients far away from what at that time was evidence-based care. So that was problem number one. Problem number two, we had high drug prices, higher than most other European countries, and we had the quickest rise. And problem number three, there was also a lack of information about what is, as a matter of fact, evidence-based. So the government, for example, or government officials, government agencies, politicians, members of parliament, they did not have an independent source of information what treatments are shown to work. So the first reform I was involved in was that we made a proposal, I was heavily involved in, that we should have something comparable to what in the old days in the US was the Office of Technology Assessment, which was finished in '95, as a matter of fact. That made, let's say, assessments, evaluations for the lower house, for basically for parliament. What treatments are, let's say, based on studies, to what degree do they work, what is the best evidence we have. It was finished in '95, but we started such an institute in the early 2000s. We call it the Institute of Quality and Efficiency in Healthcare, IQWiG, IQWIG, IQWiG. That institute was created in that time, and it was supposed to be a resource in order to solve the other two problems, basically to come up with evidence-based disease management programs, because we were lacking evidence-based treatment for many chronic diseases, and also help us to assess new drugs, whether they have, let's say, an added value in comparison to drugs that are already on the market. But so the number one reform we were working at in the early 2000s was, let's say, to come up with this institute. It is now in place. The IQWiG has 230 full-time employees. It assesses almost all new drugs. It is staffed by scientists mostly, so statisticians, doctors, and scientists. And it works according to the standards of good clinical practice, GCP, and clean trial rules. So a very rigorous assessment, typically a quantitative assessment of the studies that are either published or not published for new drugs or for treatments. And basically the government, but also the sickness funds and the doctors can request from the IQWiG information that is then used for policy guidance. And the IQWiG works under the supervision of the Ministry of Health and the government, but it is independent. It is not a government agency.
How's it paid for?
It's paid for by the sickness funds. This is something I learned from the Office of Technology.
And the sickness funds are your insurance companies?
The insurance companies, yes. They are non-profit. The German system works. We have about 100 sickness funds. They are non-profit organizations. So the German system is somewhere between a private market, where you have for-profit insurance companies, and a state-owned healthcare system, like the NHS, for example, or Scandinavian countries. So the rules that are specified hold for all the sickness funds. There is, let's say, a legal supervision of the sickness funds. It is quite clearly defined what they should cover and what they should not cover, but they are independent organizations, non-profit organizations. They are in a regulated competition. There is no, let's say, prior conditions, and there is not, let's say, no major deductibles. Everyone is, let's say, insured. So there's a comprehensive insurance scheme. So it's basically a non-profit, self-organized system. And that system organizes and also pays for the institute, the IQWiG, so that it is, let's say, a system that is governed by federal law but operated basically by independent non-profit organizations, by the sickness funds, the hospital association, and the doctors association.
And then we had you had the big prescription drug reform law called AMNOG that followed that in 2010. Were there other major building blocks of German health reform that people should know and understand?
Well, what we did, and what in my opinion was a real success, we introduced in the early 2000s non-profit drug industry independent disease management programs for the major chronic diseases where we were having problems, in particular diabetes care, coronary heart disease and heart failure, then asthma, COPD, so chronic lung diseases, and for breast cancer. And these disease management programs use the information of the IQWiG, what is evidence-based treatment, and all doctors that care for these chronically diseased patients get information, get a feedback, how they are doing in comparison to these evidence-based standards. So this really raised the quality. At the very beginning, we were having problems, in particular, for example, in diabetes care. We had many cases of preventable blindness in diabetics, amputations, renal failure. We were in the lower third in Germany. As Germany was in the lower third in the European comparisons, even in WHO comparisons, we were not doing that well. That has changed dramatically. We have become much better. And the disease management programs, these non-profit, industry-independent information systems, continuous medical education for the doctors included, made a difference. So that was, let's say, reform number 2. So reform number 1, the institute. Reform number 2, the disease management programs. Roughly speaking, 6.5 million people are now on the programs. Doctors initially were opposed, but they now like it. That is working well. Reform number 3 for the drug pricing initially failed, as a matter of fact. My own proposal, I was in those days, let's say, making the proposal for the Social Democrats. My own proposal failed. It was a proposal that we would do something like NICE, the system, National Institute of Clinical Excellence in the UK, where all new drugs are assessed, and if they are not cost effective, for example, in terms of quality adjusted life years saved, they are not reimbursed, so in essence, they do not enter the market. That was the system for which I was pushing in my position at that time, and I was surprised we were not bringing it into law, because, and that was a surprise because we had the chancellor who backed it, and we had both houses, so we could have done it, but we were not able to do it. The reason is that in the population there was a widespread agreement that Germany does not want to have drug rationing, and what NICE does is basically is considered to be a kind of rationing. Because a drug, even if it does have some added value, shown by the studies, if it is too expensive, the drug does not come to the market at all. So therefore, the drug may be available in other European countries, but not in Germany. And we were not in a position to explain to German citizens that a drug is not permitted to come to the German market, while it was, for example, on the Italian market. We could argue that on the Italian market, the drug is less expensive, so therefore they can afford it because the drug company doesn't, let's say, go for the price they want to charge in Germany. But ultimately, we lost that battle. The doctors, the population, many ethicists, as a matter of fact, they basically claimed that this type of rationing, in particular using quality-adjusted life years saved as a standard, is not acceptable.
So AMNOG emerged as an alternative to what you were unable to get through. Were you a supporter of AMNOG, or were you opposed to this because it didn't go far enough?
I was opposed to AMNOG. Mm-hmm. I was opposed to AMNOG because I thought that this is not going far enough, and I was more convinced of the beauty of the NICE system. But I changed my mind, as a matter of fact. And I nowadays think that AMNOG is a very good system. I recommend it, not only for Germany, but also for other countries. I also think it's a good system. It could be a good system for the US. That is one of the reasons why I'm often here and lecture about AMNOG. And I think AMNOG is, in that sense, the better system.
So
we have also changed it.
So how does it work? Can you explain how AMNOG happens in real life?
Yeah, AMNOG basically consists of, let's say, 3 steps. A company that comes up with a new drug.
Let's say John's drug company.
John's your drug company.
Yes.
John is coming to the market with a new drug, and if he goes through AMNOG, then he can charge the price that he wants to charge. That is guaranteed for him for 1 year, but he has to go through AMNOG. If he's not going through AMNOG, he cannot enter the market under these conditions. Then he has to either, let's say, reduce the price to what is called a reference price, so drugs that are comparable to John's drugs in terms of what they do for patients.
And reference prices are very low.
Very low prices. So John...
Almost like generics.
Yeah, almost like generics. It's sometimes, let's say, a mixture between generics and, let's say, new drugs, but the price is very close to generics. So if John comes with a new drug, he can go to the market. If he doesn't want to go into AMNOG, he goes at a reference price. And if there is no reference price, he has to sell at the price of the least expensive available competitor that does the same work. So he's getting a low price. He can access the market, but he doesn't have a high price. If he wants a high price, if John thinks he should get a high price because he believes there's a good drug, then he has to go through the AMNOG procedure. 50% at the very minimum of all new drugs goes through the AMNOG procedure. So that is what currently the situation is. 15% do not enter the German market to begin with, but these are typically only minor drugs with no loss of quality where there's many alternatives. So all of the major drugs, all of the major cancer drugs, for example, all of the major MS drugs, all of the major, let's say, drugs for heart disease, anticoagulants, they all go through AMNOGs and they all get to the German market. So AMNOG is not deterring drugs from the market. The drugs come to the market. And another 20%, roughly speaking, they go directly into the reference price group or go at the price of the least expensive competitor. 50% goes to AMNOG. AMNOG, again, comes in 3 stages. Stage number 1, the drug company that wants an AMNOG price has to submit a dossier within 3 months. This dossier has to include all published and unpublished studies. If you conceal studies, you get a severe penalty. So you subscribe to the rules of AMNOG, you provide all the studies that you have. Phase number 2, the IQWiC, that institute which I mentioned before, that does all the assessment in terms of evidence-based medicine, they basically evaluate the drug, whether it does have an additional benefit to what is on the market already, either drugs or medical treatments or surgery. So let's say the most reasonable comparator is used in order to see whether the drug has an additional benefit. And it also assesses the evidence for that benefit. So you may have a number of combinations. That the added value typically comes in 3 categories: minor added value, significant added value, or major added value. So these are the 3 categories. And then there's levels of evidence. So there might, for example, be a hint of John's drug being better. There might be an indication of John's drug being better, given his dossier. There might be proof that John's drug is better than what is on the market. There may be no data, or there may be proof that John's drug is not doing better than what is on the market already. So in essence, you have a 3-by-5 table. That's the result of the assessment. So after 6 months, you have, let's say, the dossier to the IQWiC, and you have an assessment of what the drug is doing after 6 months, because IQWiC takes 3 months to do the evaluation.
So IQWiC will give my new drug a grade.
A grade, yeah. You get a grade basically from, let's say, the best grade you could possibly get. There is proof that John's drug does add a major benefit.
Okay.
Best grade. So that's A+.
And what happens to my grade then? Who do they send it to?
They send it to a board in which the sickness funds are, a national board of the sickness funds, the hospital association, and the doctors association. But they only review the result of the assessments. They simply just confirm it. So that is on average.
But they could reject it.
They
and
could
change
reject.
it if
Yes,
wanted, but that doesn't happen.
But that typically doesn't happen because they have, by law, we wrote it into law in those days, that they have to consider the grade. So you cannot basically, you can compare them. The GBA is simply, let's say, turning back the exam papers. It's not grading the exam papers.
Mm-hmm.
So the IQWiC is grading the exam papers. The GBA, that is this national board, is giving the exam papers to the sickness funds and to the
so let's say I have
company.
a drug like Sovaldi back in 2014 that was the cure, the first cure for hepatitis C.
Very good drug.
IQWiC gives me an A+.
Yeah.
The GBA affirms my A+. Then what?
Then the negotiations about the price tab. This is, let's say, phase number 3 of the AMNOG procedure. 6 months. There is negotiation between the sickness funds as a group. They all negotiate with one board, national board, National Association of Sickness Funds. They negotiate with the drug company, and they negotiate confidentially about the price. So the price that that was initially charged for Sovaldi was therefore, after these 6 months of negotiation, it was reduced a little bit. But Sovaldi got a very good price. It is on the market. The company is doing well. They do not complain about the price. It's a fair process. AMNOG is a fair process, as a matter of fact.
And then any new drug on hepatitis C, then when it comes in, gets compared to John's drug.
It gets compared to your drug, obviously. So what AMNOG essentially does, and this makes the difference between what NICE does and, let's say, what AMNOG does. AMNOG compares drugs within, let's say, one patient category. So it does not look at quality adjusted life years. It does not compare one disease with another disease. It looks basically, let's say, John's drug here is a drug on hepatitis. It looks on whatever is possible for us to do for people with hepatitis. Mm-hmm. And so if a new drug comes out, and we have Sovaldi already, and we have a couple of interferons, for example, the new drug is assessed, what are we able to do for people with hepatitis? So then, let's say, an added value is determined if there is any or not. The level of evidence is determined, and you negotiate a price. That's the way it works. If there's no agreement in these 6 months on the price, there's an arbitration process. But this arbitration process does not postpone the decision. If the arbitration starts, it is an independent arbitration. At the time while the arbitration goes on, the drug is on the market, and it is paid for at the price the sickness funds are prepared to provide. So basically,
do many go into arbitration?
Roughly a fifth.
About
20%. But the arbitration process is not an unfair process. So AMNOG then is reviewed legally, and all the AMNOG cases, the major AMNOG cases, were upheld in the highest responsible federal social court in Germany. So AMNOG, that's in terms of, let's say, the legal challenges, has survived very well. The dossiers of IQWiC are high-quality dossiers. They are published in prestigious journals, high-impact point journals. They are reviewed publicly. There is public hearings about the results. So the AMNOG procedure and the IQWiC assessments, in my personal opinion, and I remind you that I was initially against AMNOG and the procedure, is working at a fairly high quality of, let's say, both research, and the prices have been lowered. So it is, in essence, it is a system that works. I was involved in many of the, let's say, the changes that try to make AMNOG better. But that is a very specific discussion that goes beyond what we are doing here today.
So what's been the track record now over 10 years of the AMNOG? How well has the system performed?
If you look at the endpoints, first of all of the new big drugs that have come to the American market have also entered the German market. So it does not deter innovation to come to the German market. And 150 prices by now have been set. And the cost increase that we were having in terms of drug expenditures as a total budget has been slashed by 50%. We, before AMNOG, were seeing total cost increases of about 7 to 10% per year. And that was not a sustainable solution. We were also seeing bigger cost increases than most other European countries. AMNOG has reduced this to, let's say, 3 to 5%, 3 to 4.5% in that order. So it has halved the cost increase. And more importantly, it has also reduced cost increase in all of Europe, because many European countries look at the AMNOG prices and consider them in their what is called reference price baskets. Germany is a part of most reference price baskets in Germany. So if AMNOG reduces a price in Germany, that indirectly lowers price increases in almost all of Europe. And that also played out because in, let's say, the European countries, cost increases have been reduced ever since AMNOG was introduced in 2010. So it's an important system for all of Europe.
So when we have discussions about this in the United States, we frequently hear the pharmaceutical industry and the biotechnology industry say, listen, if you do these kinds of systems, you're going to crush innovation and you'll have no more new innovative drugs coming to market because government is going to then squash innovation. Have you seen any of that happen in Germany with this system?
Clearly not. I mean, there was clearly, let's say, what the drug companies threatened when AMNOG was introduced, but it hasn't happened. First of all, in comparison, in contrast, not in comparison, but in contrast to NICE, all the new drugs get to the German market immediately after admission. So if there's European admission of a drug, it comes to the market directly. So we haven't seen important drugs not come to the German market at the moment when they were admitted. So there was no deterrence to enter the German market. And number two, if you have a good drug, I mean, speaking about innovation, you mentioned innovation, the risk of innovation not coming to the market. I mean, if you have a good drug, AMNOG is a very predictable, it's a very reliable and also very lucrative, profitable route to go, because it shows you have most likely the result will be you have proof of major benefit. So if you have proof of major benefit, you can charge a high price. AMNOG punishes the drugs that are in essence, allow me to put it that way, Me Too drugs.
Me Too.
Me Too drugs.
Copycats.
Copycats, yes. The drugs that come at a higher price with a slightly changed molecule that for us doctors is not much of a benefit. These drugs in the old days were driving a lot of the, let's say, market prices. And this is not an incentive for research.
How do the physicians in Germany feel about this system?
German physicians, as far as they do know the system, they, in all things considered, they like it. First of all, they get the AMNOG detailing. So the AMNOG, let's say, assessments go into all doctors' offices. They are available. They are published. So if you want to learn what a drug is really able to do for you and for your patients, the information by EQUIC in the AMNOG procedure is highly relevant. It is worthwhile, obviously. And we will have patient versions of that in the future as well. Number two, doctors really don't like drug costs getting out of hand. It limits the budget for their own income. They also do not like to see a rip-off by companies. So in that sense, I would say that most doctors by now are, let's say, at least at peace with MNOG, if not even liking the system.
So you said that you initially preferred the NICE system in the UK, and you now decided you prefer AMNOG. Can you describe what are the essential differences between NICE and AMNOG that lead you now to say that you think AMNOG is actually a better or more appropriate solution for the United States?
Well, there are three issues where I believe AMNOG is better than NICE. Number one, NICE, in one way or another, has to attach a money value to a life year gain. For example, a quality-adjusted life year gain. So if you compare drug A to B, and drug A is, let's say, 50,000 euros per life year saved, and drug B is, let's say, 200,000 euros per life year saved, then you pay under NICE conditions, ceteris paribus, you pay for drug A, but not for drug B. But drug B may still be the only option for the people that depend on the drug. So you would have to argue to the public, 200,000 euros per life year saved, it's not worth the money. Even if the, let's say, patients involved are children. So that is a tough sell, as a matter of fact. You can barely explain it to doctors you can barely explain it to patients, the patients that need the drug. So a drug that then is in essence not on the market because it is not paid for. That is a form of rationing which is very difficult to defend from an ethical, but indeed from a politics point of view. I learned this the hard way. Problem number two is, in NICE, as I pointed out, the question is you are either reimbursed or not. In AMNOG, it is just the question, at what price are you reimbursed? In NICE, you may not be reimbursed at all. So the drug is not available at the market. So there, let's say, what you could call innovation stifling effect that you were proposing for AMNOG, it is clearly there. Because a number of the drugs that we have available in many European countries are not available in the UK because they don't manage the NICE process. And number three, I think a system may be beautiful from the science perspective, but if you cannot defend it in the public, and if doctors do not like it, and if patients do not like it, it is not really politically robust. So the little I can add to this discussion is that I have, let's say, for better or worse, as the experience of a combination of, let's say, work in science and also the experience as a politician. And as a politician, I can tell you, if you are not able to defend your rules with a couple of sentences in a transparent way to the public or to doctors, the system will not be defensible. That's what I think is the biggest problem in NICE. May work in other cultures, may work in the UK, but keep in mind, in the UK, there is also the cancer fund. So many cancer drugs are funded in parallel to what NICE is doing. And it would be my assumption if, let's say, all new cancer drugs would go through NICE, and that would be their only chance to get to the market, their only chance. I would think that NICE would even have a hard time in the UK, but in Germany it would clearly not be an option. And I think in most European countries it would not be an option. So therefore the advantages of AMNOG over NICE, in my opinion, are that there is no quality adjusted life years comparisons that are ethically controversial. There is, let's say, a system that allows all new drugs to the market, no rationing. And it is a system that appeals to doctors and appeals to many, let's say, interested in the population or policymakers.
Now, there are some special categories of drugs. I wonder if you can tell us how they are treated under AMNOG. So first of all, you have orphan drugs that deal with small, discrete conditions, and then you also have the category known as biopharmaceutical products, the biosimilars, that are generic-like versions of biopharmaceutical drugs. How are those two, biosimilars and orphan drugs, treated in the AMNOG process? Because those are both growing important categories of pharmaceuticals.
Right. Well, orphan drugs come basically in two flavors. There's those orphan drugs that have a very small share of the total market. So they do not go through AMNOG whatsoever.
So they're exempt.
They are exempt, exactly. And flavor number two, orphan drugs that do have a certain market value in total budget, they go through AMNOG, but they are immediately assumed to have major benefit. So they enter the market, they go through AMNOG, but they have major added benefit, I would say so by definition, and it then goes immediately into the price negotiations. So let's call that an abbreviated form of the AMNOG process. Now coming to biosimilars. In Germany, we made it quite clear that when it comes to biosimilars, we want to allow them to flourish for a while to create the market. So therefore, the biosimilars originally were not part of the AMNOG procedure, so we would call that exempt.
Mm-hmm.
But in the long run, they will be included, and we have also specified the law how this is done. But this is fairly complicated and goes beyond what we can cover in this session, I would assume at least. But in the intermediate run, the biosimilars will also go through AMNOG, as do, for example, breakthrough admissions, as do, for example, let's say, fast track admissions. So, and also, let's say, admissions to the market that do not rely on randomized controlled trials. They are all worked into the AMNOG procedure. Sometimes, and that is important to keep in mind, that is a way where, in my opinion, AMNOG actually helps innovation. We permit a drug to the market, specify a price, but we know that we do not have good data. So then a study is made mandatory, and the reimbursement of the drug is guaranteed within the study. But the drug company, let's say it's John again, with another new drug coming to the market, he then has to basically guarantee that he enrolls patients in a study with a comparator on which me negotiating for the AMNOG, him negotiating for his drug company, agree upon. So there is a comparator, we have a study, he gets a preliminary price, but he agrees that, let's say, if the study shows that the drug isn't as good as John suggested it is, that we reduce his price. That's roughly how it works.
So this is a 10-year-old system now. This is its 10th year
right.
in existence since it was first passed. And it's not under any significant, serious political threat at all of repeal. But look ahead, if you can, into the future, 5 or 10 years. What do you see as the future challenges for this system? And if we were 10 years into the future, what would you think are some of the areas that will look differently 10 years from now than how they look today?
I can only speak, let's say, from the perspective of, let's say, Germany, and what my assessment of the current experience is. First of all, I think that the major changes will be made within AMNOG and not around AMNOG. So we will find ways to better deal with orphan drugs. We will find ways to deal better with, let's say, drugs in oncology, for example, that come in multi-arm studies, which have flexible endpoints and that have, for example, target baskets. For example, oncology drugs that not only work for, let's say, renal cancer, but cover different organs with the same cancer, where, let's say, the disease is more organized around a genetic background and not, let's say, an organ and so forth. So these changes will be made within AMNOG. And the system will become ever more refined. And I think the system is well prepared for that because, as I said before, it is based on, let's say, study evaluations by the IQWiC. So in that sense, we will, let's say, make it ever more complicated, ever more sophisticated, but it has to fit the new development. So that is number one. And number two, we will, in the market, also need, apart from AMNOG, rules that govern the use of the drug. I remind you, AMNOG is just a system that sets the price. So there should be a fair price for the drug, but it does not deal with the question, is the drug ideally used in the market? That is, for example, when it comes to breast cancer, covered by the disease management programs, or for diabetes, for example, or heart disease, or pulmonary diseases. So therefore, let's say the AMNOG works, in my opinion, in my biased opinion, but it works nicely together with industry-independent, evidence-based disease management programs. But what we will also have to do is basically to limit overuse and misuse of the same drugs. So for example, we want to make sure that a drug that works in particular genetic cases of a particular cancer is used in cases where it is unlikely to help and where very often the patient sustains more harm from the treatment than he benefits. So we allow for that in allowing the physicians at the sickness funds to come up with contracts on a state level that specifies who exactly should get the drug. The price, again, determined by AMNOG, is already independently set, obviously. But the best use of the drug has to be specified in mutual agreements between the sickness funds and the doctors, and that is an independent, and I see more of that to come. So the major developments, in my opinion, first of all, I think AMNOG will survive. It will not be replaced by a nice type of a system, and will not be taken down, because everyone knows that we need a system like that in place. The changes will be made within the system, and we will additionally outside of the system see more contracts that more clearly specify in what way should we use the drug if we want to stay as close, as tight to a good evidence-based treatment as possible.
Are there any other countries that have copied AMNOG?
No, not yet. AMNOG is very influential in Europe because the AMNOG, let's say, dossiers, the IQWiC dossiers, and also the prices are used a lot. I think that the NICE information and the AMNOG information are the two most important pieces of information for drug pricing in Europe.
Do they usually agree, or do they vary substantially?
They vary. Sometimes substantially. But there's also agreement. And both two institutions are working together quite closely. So it's, let's say, a company of drug researchers working in these institutions that work together a lot. So
is there a pattern to the variation? Does AMNOG tend to normally go one way versus NICE, or is it much more idiosyncratic to the drug?
It's more idiosyncratic to the drug, I would say. And again, the biggest difference is AMNOG assesses added value only from the doctor's perspective. So if I say, for example, major added benefit, that's from the physician's point of view. That may be different from the perspective of society.
Mm-hmm. Which NICE looks at.
For example, let's say you have the same drug. John's drug, I have the drug. We have exactly the same drug. Makes the same difference for the patient. Let's assume that's a drug that saves 2 years worth of high quality life. Your drug, my drug. The only difference basically between the two drugs is that John's drug works in old people my drug works in, let's say, young people. Then from the perspective of NICE, my drug is better than his drug, because the people that I take care of are younger and on average have a higher quality of life than John's patients. So from the societal perspective, I do better in NICE than John is doing. From the doctor's perspective, that makes no difference. If I can gain 2 years worth of good life in an old patient or a young patient, from a doctor's perspective, that typically doesn't make and should not make a difference. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the differences. So in that sense, I would say, let's say the AMNOG view of things is that the intuitive way of looking at things from the perspective of doctors and patients. Also, as a patient, it would not make a difference for you.
President Trump has repeatedly charged that the United States is basically subsidizing pharmaceutical innovation for the rest of the world because we pay so much of a premium that subsidizes, and the rest of you are freeloaders on our system. How would you reply back to President Trump on that charge, if you could? Well, what would you say to him?
First of all, from my own, let's say, research in that field, I clearly know that most of the, let's say, compounds that ultimately lead to major breakthroughs in drugs, that research is university driven. So these are not the companies. I mean, the companies, they basically develop the drug and they market the drugs. But the original research, that is typically university research, and that is done in Europe as it is done in the US. And it's also not, let's say, it is not we are indeed spending not enough for this type of research, but these are not the huge costs in comparison to what the drugs are later costing us. So that is that. So the original research is actually a very minor proportion of the total prices of drugs later on. And number two, I mean, I cannot see what he's talking about when it comes to, let's say, the European drug market, because this is a market where still the companies are making a reasonable profit. So even in the German or in most European countries, in these markets, drug companies who have new drugs, they operate at a profit of, let's say, 10, 15, sometimes 20%. So I cannot see why such a market would not be a market that gives you all the incentive you need in order to do good research. On the contrary, I believe in a market where all new drugs are reimbursed at high prices, even if they are not good drugs, as there's, let's say, little scientific assessment, you would expect many drugs come to the market that do not add much of a value. There are Me Too drugs, or drugs that, let's say, have only minor added benefits. So I think that's a rigorous assessment where the science plays in. This punishes the companies that are very well at marketing a drug, mm-hmm. but not as good as in the research. Mm-hmm. While, let's say, a more rigorous assessment, as we are currently seeing in both NICE or AMNOG or similar institutions, that helps the drug companies that do real research, that have real value. So I cannot, with all respect to President Trump, I'm not convinced by his argument.
So we're almost out of time. Last question. What lessons should Americans draw from the AMNOG experience as we consider how we want to, as a society, try to restrain the rate of growth of the cost of new drugs and the prices for existing drugs?
Well, my first recommendation, I think, is the one which I think is a recommendation that has the highest importance. I was always convinced, and I am still convinced, that all drug pricing regulation should also aim at improving the quality of care. So make the process as scientific as possible. Don't make it a simple bargaining process, a basket process, or a reference price group process. Look at, let's say, what the drugs are doing and reward the good drugs, punish the poor drugs. So then you are basically not only slowing the rate of cost increase, but you are helping better care. So combine the goal of improving the quality of care with your cost control measures. That was what we wanted to do with NICE, with AMNOG, with the evidence-based disease management programs. Don't just look at cost control and quality of care independently, but combine this. Make a virtue out of what has to be done anyway. You have to do cost control, so use it in order to improve quality of care. That's recommendation number one. In my opinion, the most important recommendation. Recommendation number two, make it one system for the whole country. Because if you really want to do a high quality job, it makes no sense to do this in every state, for example, or for all
different payers.
For example, or basically for to have a different system for different types of drugs and so forth. Make it simply one system, if possible, for all drugs that works at a very high level of quality, transparency, make all of this public. So it's better to have one good system for everything than to have, let's say, 5, 10, or 15 systems for different states, payers, or let's say sorts of drugs. And number three, always combine, let's say, what you scientifically think is best with what is politically feasible. So never forget, politics is about what it is right to do and what it is wrong to do. It is not about true or false, what is basically the work of science. So as a scientist, you basically try to find out what is true, what is false. In politics, you have to consider what is right and what is wrong, and try to align what is right as much with what is true as you can. So that would be recommendation number 3.
Dr. Lauterbach, congratulations on your career, on your accomplishments in advancing German health policy, and thanks for sharing this time and your thoughts with us.
Thank you so much for the invitation and for this opportunity. I enjoyed it, and good luck with your work as well, John.
Great, thank you. And thank all of you for joining us, and we hope that you found this helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.